July 1982. A cheap motel room in Miami. Cleaning staff opens the door for the daily service. What they find inside that bathroom will haunt Miami homicide detectives for decades. A man has been tortured and killed with a chainsaw. Not shot, not stabbed, not beaten. A chainsaw. The bathtub is a crime scene so disturbing that veteran detectives, men who've walked into hundreds of murders, men who've seen what bullets and knives do to human bodies, have to step outside and collect themselves before they can work. This wasn't the first chainsaw murder in Miami that year. It won't be the last 2 years later. In 1983, 200 million people around the world will watch Al Pacino tied to a shower curtain rod while Colombian hitmen rev up a chainsaw in a cheap Miami bathroom. That scene, that specific weapon, that specific method of execution, that specific setting did not come from Oliver Stone's imagination. It came from D case files. It came from Miami Herald crime reports. It came from something that actually happened multiple times. In a city that Hollywood would turn into the most iconic gangster film of all time, here's the second thing you need to know. The man who is arguably the primary real-world inspiration for Tony Montana, Cuban-born, Miami-based cocaine empire, exotic animals. The whole thing is alive right now. Today, he runs a zoo in Miami. He was on Netflix in 2020. He was sentenced to 100 years in federal prison and served 12. He is 63 years old, and he feeds tigers every morning. His name is Mario Tabraue, and we're going to get to him. You've seen Scarface. You can quote it. Say hello to my little friend. The world is yours. Every day above ground is a good day. But you have never heard the real story. The actual people. The actual events. The actual murders. The actual mansions. The actual mountains of cash. Because Tony Montana isn't based on one person. He's based on all of them. Cuban refugees who arrived in Miami in 1980 with nothing and built cocaine empires worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Men who lived in mansions with private zoos. Men who drove fleets of Ferraris. Men who killed with chainsaws and car bombs in motorcycle drive-bys. Men who were eventually arrested, convicted, and sent to federal prison. And some of them survived. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? Have you seen Scarface? Because what you're about to learn is going to change how you see that movie forever. This is the complete true story of Miami's Cocaine Cowboys. Every fact sourced, every person real. Every event documented from Cuba in April 1980 to the D crackdowns of the late 1980s to the man who is alive today running a zoo in Miami. Let's begin. To understand what's about to happen to Miami, you have to understand what was happening in Cuba in 1980. And what was happening in Cuba in 1980 was a slow-motion catastrophe. Fidel Castro had been running the island for over 20 years. The Cuban Revolution of 1959 had promised equality, literacy, health care, the end of American imperial exploitation. And in certain narrow ways, it had delivered. Cuba had more doctors per capita than most of Latin America. Literacy was genuinely high, but the economy? The economy was a disaster. The agricultural collectivization program had failed spectacularly. Sugar, Cuba's primary export, was being sold at Soviet-subsidized prices that bore no relationship to market reality. Soviet foreign aid was popping up the entire system. And by 1979 and 1980, even that Soviet lifeline was beginning to strain. As Moscow faced its own economic pressures and the catastrophic invasion of Afghanistan ate up resources, Cuban citizens were living under severe rationing. Meat was rationed, rice was rationed, Clothing was rationed. A typical Cuban family was surviving on government allocations that barely covered basic caloric needs. There were no private businesses, no freedom to start a company, no way to accumulate wealth legally. The black market existed, but getting caught trading on it meant prison time, and people were miserable. The thing about miserable people is they start looking for exits. And in 1980, Cuban people began finding one. On April 1st, 1980, April Fool's Day, though nobody was laughing, a group of Cubans seeking political asylum did something desperate and dramatic. A man named Hector San Eustace and 4 companions commandeered a bus and drove it at full speed directly through the gates of the Peruvian embassy in Havana. They crashed through the metal barriers. They forced their way onto the embassy grounds, which under international law made them technically unreachable by Cuban authorities. In the chaos, a Cuban embassy guard was killed. Castro was furious, in a fit of rage or calculated strategic decision, depending on how you read it. Castro announced that Cuba was withdrawing all of its security forces from around the Peruvian embassy. He publicly declared that any Cuban who wanted to leave could simply go to the embassy and wait. He expected maybe a few hundred people, maybe 1,000. He wanted to shame the asylum seekers, to prove they were a tiny fringe. What actually happened broke him. Within 48 hours, over 10,000 Cubans had flooded into the Peruvian embassy compound. 10,000 people in 48 hours. The compound was designed for a diplomatic staff of dozens. There were people hanging from the trees, people sleeping on every available inch of grass, people going to the bathroom in corners because there were no facilities. No food, no water. People passed out from heat and dehydration. And they kept coming. The images went around the world. The international press covered it extensively. And for Fidel Castro, this was a catastrophic political humiliation on the global stage. He had claimed for 20 years that the Cuban people loved their revolution, loved their system, didn't want to leave. And here was 10,000 people in one compound saying, in the clearest possible terms, the exact opposite. Castro needed a response. He needed a way to turn this disaster into something that looked like a strategic move, not a humiliation. He found one on April 20th, 1980. Castro made an announcement that stunned the world. He declared the port of Mariel open. Any Cuban who wanted to leave, he said, could leave. And any Cuban Americans who wanted to come get their relatives could come in boats and pick them up. On the surface, this looked like a humanitarian gesture, a softening of an authoritarian government. The international community cautiously applauded, but Castro was not making a humanitarian gesture. He was making a calculated strike, because here's what he was planning, and what very few people in Washington immediately understood. He was going to use this moment to empty Cuba of everyone he considered a problem. The dissenters, the homosexuals, the people his government considered antisocial elements, the petty criminals, the serious criminals, the mentally ill, people in his prisons, people in his psychiatric institutions. He was going to put all of them on boats and send them to Florida. He called it a cleansing. His propaganda machine portrayed the departing Cubans as the dregs of Cuban society, bums and antisocial elements, his actual phrase in multiple documented speeches. He organized what became known as acts of repudiation, organized mobs that would show up at the homes of people waiting to leave, throw eggs, throw rocks, shout insults, beat them in some cases. You want to leave Cuba? Fine, but you're going to be humiliated on your way out the door. You're going to be branded a traitor, a parasite, a coward, and this is the part that changed Miami forever. Those people were going to land in Florida. What happened next was one of the largest, fastest mass migrations in American history. And it was about to turn the most glamorous retirement city in America into the most violent city on the continent. Picture this. It's April 1980. You are a Cuban American living in Miami. You have relatives in Cuba, a mother, brothers, cousins, who you haven't seen in years or decades because the Castro government severely restricted travel. And suddenly, out of nowhere, the door is open. All you have to do is get a boat to Mariel Harbor, 25 miles west of Havana, and you can bring them home. Cuban Americans mobilized immediately. Boats of every size and description left from Key West, from the Miami River, from marinas up and down the Florida coast. Fishing boats, pleasure yachts, cabin cruisers, sailing vessels, anything that could float and cross 90 miles of open water. It became a flotilla. It became a fleet. It became one of the most extraordinary and chaotic scenes in American maritime history. Between April 15th and October 31st, 1980, 6 months and 2 weeks, approximately, 125,000 Cubans arrived in Florida. 125,000 people in 6 months? To put that in perspective, Miami's population in 1980 was roughly 350,000 people. In 6 months, the city's population grew by more than a third, 35%, overnight with no warning, no infrastructure planning, no additional housing, no additional schools, no additional hospitals. But the numbers are not the most important part of this story. The most important part is who Castro put on those boats. Here's how it worked. When a Cuban American arrived in Mariel Harbor with their boat to pick up their family member, Cuban government officials would meet them at the dock. And those officials would say, yes, you can take your relative, but you also have to take these other people. And they would load additional passengers onto the boat. People the family didn't know, people they hadn't come for. These additional passengers were, in many cases, exactly the people Castro wanted to export. Castro had emptied jails, he had emptied psychiatric hospitals. He had given prisoners a choice, emigrate or stay behind bars. He had targeted the people his government considered most problematic and most dangerous. And he had put them on American boats, the U.S. State Department would later estimate that somewhere between 25,000 and 40,000 of the 125,000 arrivals had criminal histories of some kind in Cuba. The more cautious government estimates, cross-referencing the most serious categories, found approximately 2,700 what they called hardened criminals, people convicted of serious violent offenses in Cuba. 2,700 violent criminals inserted into a city of 350,000 people. In 6 months, the processing system was completely overwhelmed. The U.S. government had not planned for this. There were no facilities. Refugees were initially processed at the Orange Bowl Stadium in Miami. Yes, a football stadium. Thousands of people sleeping on bleachers and on the field. In the Florida summer heat, waiting to be interviewed by immigration officials who were wildly outnumbered and working around the clock. The interviews were supposed to screen out criminals. In theory, officials would ask about criminal backgrounds, cross-reference Cuban government records when those records were available and reliable, which was not often, can make determinations about who could be admitted. In practice, it was chaos. Interrogations that were supposed to take hours were compressed to minutes. Translation was inadequate. There weren't enough Spanish-speaking immigration officials. Record sharing from Cuba was inconsistent and sometimes deliberately misleading. And the Cuban government had coached many of the criminals on exactly what to say. deny everything, claim to be a political prisoner, claim the charges against you were fabricated by the revolutionary government. Claim you're here because you disagree with Castro. It was brilliant and diabolical. Because many legitimate political prisoners were saying exactly those things. How do you distinguish between a genuine dissident and a violent criminal using the same script? You often couldn't, and so people got through frankly. Even the honest arrivals created an overwhelming challenge. Medical screenings were cursory. Background checks were impossible to complete properly at that volume and speed. The Ings was screening thousands of people per day, real. Thorough vetting would have taken weeks per person. Nobody had weeks. The honest refugees, the vast majority of the 125,000, went on to build genuinely remarkable lives in Miami. Cuban Americans would go on to transform the city economically, politically, and culturally in ways that are nothing short of extraordinary. Miami today is, in no small part, the product of that community's energy and ambition and work ethic. But mixed into that 125,000 was a cohort of violent, organized, experienced criminals who arrived in the most cocaine-saturated city in America at the exact moment when the cocaine trade was exploding into billions of dollars a year. And they were hungry. The Miami Herald ran stories throughout the summer of 1980, documenting the processing chaos. Local politicians pleaded with the federal government for resources. Miami's mayor said publicly that the city was being overwhelmed. The Florida governor declared a state of emergency. Washington largely failed to respond adequately. The Carter administration, already dealing with the Iran hostage crisis and a brutal election campaign, did not have the bandwidth or the political will to shut down the boat lift, which would have looked heartless, or to dramatically scale up processing resources. And so the boats kept coming, and coming, and coming. One particularly important detail that doesn't get discussed enough. Many of the Mariel criminals who made it through were not first-time offenders. They were experienced. They had been in the Cuban prison system, which is brutal, and they had survived it. They were tougher than most criminals law enforcement was used to dealing with in the United States. They had connections to each other from prison. They spoke a language that Miami's existing law enforcement barely understood. They had networks. They had relationships. And they had absolutely nothing to lose. They arrived in Miami in the summer and fall of 1980, into a city that was already in the early stages of a cocaine war. The infrastructure was being built. The money was starting to flow. The Colombian suppliers needed American end distributors, needed people who could move product on the street, needed muscle, needed soldiers who would follow orders and weren't afraid to use violence. The Mariel arrivals filled that need perfectly, and within 18 months, Miami would become the most dangerous city in the United States of America. Here's a question that doesn't get asked enough. Why Miami? Of all the cities in America, why did Miami become the cocaine capital? Why not Los Angeles, which had a bigger port? Why not New York, which had a larger organized crime infrastructure? Why not Houston, which sat right on the Mexican border? The answer involves geography, community, and timing, and it explains almost everything geography first. Miami sits at the tip of Florida, roughly 700 miles southeast of New Orleans, roughly 1,300 miles from New York. But it is only 700 miles from Medellín, Colombia, and much of that distance is open ocean dotted with thousands of islands, cays, and inlets in the Caribbean and the Bahamas. Those islands are almost impossible to monitor comprehensively. You can make a boat virtually invisible by threading through the Bahamas in the dark. You can transfer cargo at sea with no witnesses. You can land on a private dock anywhere along Florida's 1,200 miles of coastline. Community second. By 1980, Miami had the largest Cuban-American community in the United States, a community built by the first wave of refugees who fled Castro in the early 1960s. These were overwhelmingly educated, professional, middle-class people who had rebuilt their lives and built a thriving economy in South Florida over 20 years. They were bilingual. They had connections throughout Latin America. They had cultural comfort with Colombians in a way that Anglo-American cities didn't. When the Medellín cartel needed American partners, people who could handle the U.S. end of the cocaine supply chain, who spoke Spanish, who understood Colombian culture, who had roots in the Miami community, that existing network was invaluable. Timing third, by 1980, Pablo Escobar and the Medellín cartel were in the process of becoming the single largest drug trafficking organization in history. Escobar, born in 1949 in a small Colombian town, had worked his way up from petty theft and kidnapping to controlling a cocaine operation of genuinely staggering scale. By the early 1980s, the Medellín cartel was producing an estimated 80% of the world's cocaine supply. Let me put the economics in terms that make your brain stop working correctly for a moment. In Colombia, a kilogram of cocaine cost approximately $1,500 to $2,000 to produce and ship to the United States. By the time that kilogram hit Miami, wholesale, meaning it had crossed the ocean, and landed in a warehouse somewhere in South Florida, it was worth approximately $15,000 to $25,000. And by the time that same kilogram had been broken into grams and sold on the street in Miami or moved up the coast to New York, it was worth $55,000 or more. That margin, buying at $2,000, selling at $55,000, is a 2,700% markup. For a product that weighs 2 pounds and fits in a shoebox, the scale was incomprehensible. At the peak of the cocaine boom in the early 1980s, the analysts estimated that $12 billion worth of cocaine was flowing through Miami annually. Some private estimates put it higher. $12 billion per year in $1,982, flowing through a city of 350,000 people. To process that volume, you needed infrastructure. You needed pilots who could fly twin-engine planes from the Bahamas to private airstrips in the Florida Everglades. You needed boat captains who could run fast cigarette boats from the Bahamas to Miami waterways at 3 a.m. You needed warehouse space to store product. You needed distributors who could break down 100-kilo shipments into multi-kilo packages. You needed street-level sellers who could move grams and 8 balls to the end users. You needed money launderers who could take tens of millions in cash and transform it into legitimate business revenue. You needed lawyers who wouldn't ask too many questions. You needed real estate agents who wouldn't report cash purchases. You needed politicians and police officers who could be convinced that looking the other way was more profitable than looking forward. This was a full-scale underground economy, and Miami built it faster than any city in American history. The existing Cuban-American business community, for the most part, had nothing to do with this. They were as horrified as anyone. But the Mariel arrivals, the pre-existing Colombian community in Miami, a handful of well-connected Americans who had ties to the old mob infrastructure, and a network of Colombian suppliers created something that law enforcement had never seen before. An international cocaine franchise, with Miami as the American headquarters. And at the center of all of it were a handful of men living lives that were, in every conceivable way, the real-life version of Scarface. 3 men, 3 stories, all happening simultaneously in the same city at the same time. And all three of them, in different ways, wrote the script that Oliver Stone turned into one of the most culturally significant films of the 20th century. Let's start with the one who is still alive, Mario Tabraue. Mario Tabraue was born in Cuba in 1961. He was 19 years old when the Mariel Boatlift happened in 1980. He didn't come over on the boat lift. His family had already established themselves in Miami. Before that, but the timing matters because he came of age in Miami at precisely the moment when the cocaine economy was exploding. He started like Tony Montana started. From nothing, small deliveries, running packages, learning the business from the bottom, building a reputation one deal at a time. He wasn't some college-educated businessman who stumbled into crime. He was a young Cuban-American kid in Miami who saw what the money looked like and decided he wanted it. He also had, from a very young age, an obsession with exotic animals. This is not a minor detail. It goes to the heart of who this man was and is. Even as a teenager, Tabraue was acquiring exotic birds, reptiles, unusual creatures. He ran a legitimate exotic animal import business called Zoological Imports Unlimited, and later, Pets Unlimited. The animals were real. The passion was genuine, but the business also provided something extremely valuable in the cocaine world: a cover. By the mid-1980s, Mario Tabraue was operating a drug trafficking network that federal prosecutors would later describe as worth approximately $75 million. $75 million. In 1985 money, the operation involved cocaine and marijuana, distribution routes through Louisiana and Florida, a network of associates, many of whom were Mariel arrivals, and a business model that used the exotic animal trade as both cover and, Tabraue would later say in interviews, motivation. He said he sold drugs partly to fund his animals, to keep his lions and tigers and cheetahs in the best possible conditions. He had a mansion in Coconut Grove. At various points, the compound housed 2 cheetahs, 5 monkeys, 6 cobras, 4 rattlesnakes, hyacinth macaws, multiple exotic birds, and a rotating collection of big cats. This was not a metaphor. This was not a film set. This was a real place where a real man with a real drug empire went home every night to feed his exotic animals. Sound familiar? Tony Montana's fish tank, Tony Montana's pet tiger in the mansion scenes. The filmmakers knew exactly what they were doing. The operation also had a brutal side. In July 1980, a man named Larry Nash, a federal ATF informant who had been working inside the operation, was murdered. According to testimony at trial and reporting by the Miami New Times, Tabraue was involved in the aftermath of the killing, and a chainsaw was used in the disposal of the body. Tabraue has always maintained a complicated story about exactly what his role was, but the chainsaw detail entered federal case files, and Oliver Stone was reading federal case files while writing Scarface. Let me be clear about something. When you watch that shower scene in Scarface, when the chainsaw starts up, when Al Pacino screams, you are watching something that is directly connected to documented events in Miami. In 1980, the federal government broke up Tabraue's operation in a de-investigation called Operation Cobra, named, with particular irony, after the exotic animals that gave his business its cover. The operation culminated in his arrest in late 1987. The charges were extensive: 61 counts of racketeering, drug trafficking, conspiracy to murder federal agents. The evidence was overwhelming: wiretaps, financial records, cooperating witnesses who had been inside the operation. In 1989, Mario Tabraue was convicted and sentenced to 100 years in federal prison. 100 years. He served 12. After cooperating with federal authorities, providing testimony that helped convict other members of the Miami underworld, Tabraue was released in late 1999. He was 38 years old. What did he do? He went back to his animals. He founded the Zoological Wildlife Foundation in Miami in 2000 with his wife Maria, whom he met after his release. It is a real organization at a real address in Miami. You can visit it. They do conservation work, education programs, work with big cats and primates and birds. It is accredited as an exotic animal encounter facility. And in 2020, Mario Tabraue appeared in Netflix's Tiger King, on camera, talking openly about his past, acknowledging his role in the drug trade, referencing the Scarface comparisons directly, saying, with a calm that is genuinely chilling, the money coming in suitcases to the bank? I did that. He is 63 years old as of 2024. He goes to work every morning and feeds tigers. Think about that for a second. Tony Montana dies face first in a fountain, riddled with bullets. The real man's, the living, breathing inspiration for that character, is alive, feeding big cats in Miami on Netflix. Which story is more extraordinary? Jon Roberts, Rico Bono. Jon Roberts is a different kind of story. Not a Mariel refugee, not a Cuban American. He was born John Rico Bono in New York City in 1948, into a family with deep connections to the American mob. His uncle was a figure in the New York underworld. Violence and organized crime were not alien concepts to him. They were the water he swam in from childhood. He moved to Miami in the early 1970s, as many New York mob-adjacent figures did, looking for new opportunities in a growing city. At first, his activities were relatively small scale, the kinds of criminal enterprises that the mob had always run. But Miami, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, was presenting an entirely different kind of opportunity. The Medellín cartel needed American operators, people who could handle the U.S. end of the supply chain, who had the criminal infrastructure to distribute, launder, and manage product at enormous scale, and who were insulated from the Colombian side of the business. The fewer direct connections between the Colombian producers and the American distributors, the better for everyone's security. Jon Roberts became one of the most important American operators in the entire Medellín supply chain. He developed a direct working relationship with Pablo Escobar himself, one of the very few Americans who can make that claim. In the book he co-wrote with journalist Evan Wright, American Desperado, 2011, Roberts describes his interactions with Escobar in remarkable detail. The mutual respect, the careful boundaries, the clear understanding of who held ultimate power. His operation, working with a pilot named Mickey Monday, was handling shipments of between 1,000 and 3,000 kilograms per delivery, at $15,000 to $25,000 per kilo wholesale. A single 2,000 kilo delivery was worth $30 million to $50 million, and they were doing multiple deliveries. The money was the problem. Not too little money, too much. Roberts described in his memoir, and this is one of the most jaw-dropping passages in the entire book, literally not being able to count it fast enough. Having industrial currency counters, the kind that banks use, running 24 hours a day in his home, still not keeping up, cash arriving in duffel bags, in suitcases, in boxes, faster than any reasonable laundering operation could process. He had a mansion on Star Island, the most exclusive residential enclave in Miami, a private island accessible only by a guarded bridge, where celebrities, billionaires, and royalty have lived. He paid for it in cash. He described walking into the real estate office with a duffel bag. No negotiation, no financing, cash at his peak. Jon Roberts owned 7 Ferraris simultaneously, not over his lifetime, at the same time. 7 Ferraris parked in or around his Star Island mansion on any given day. A Testarossa, multiple 308s and 328s, a Boxer. The prices in 1982 ranged from $60,000 to $150,000 each, the equivalent of $180,000 to $450,000 in today's money. He bought them at dealerships with cash in duffel bags. Dealers filed the required currency reports. Almost no enforcement followed. Jon Roberts is also the man who embodies the Jon Roberts as Tony Montana element of the story. The American immigrant who made it, the immigrant-adjacent figure who used the cocaine trade to build a lifestyle that looked, from the outside, exactly like the fantasy sold in every 80s music video and movie. He was eventually arrested in the late 1980s as the D Task Force swept through Miami's cocaine network. Like many of his peers, he cooperated with federal authorities, provided testimony, and received a reduced sentence. He was released in the early 2000s. In 2011, he co-wrote his memoir American Desperado with Evan Wright, the journalist who also wrote Generation Kill about U.S. Marines in Iraq. It is a remarkably detailed, unflinching account of his entire criminal career. From New York mob soldier to cocaine cowboy to DEA cooperator. It's sourced, it's specific. It has names and dates and addresses. Jon Roberts died in 2011. The same year the book was published, Of Natural Causes, in a bed, not in a fountain riddled with bullets. Max Mermelstein. Max Mermelstein is the most different of the three, and in some ways the most important. Born November 1st, 1942, in Brooklyn, New York, Mermelstein was not a gangster. He was an engineer, a mechanical engineer with actual professional credentials. Working a legitimate career, he was smart, organized, analytical, the kind of person who looks at a system and figures out how to make it more efficient. He met his wife through a Colombian community in Florida, through her family and social connections. He was gradually drawn into the orbit of the Medellín cartel, not through violence or coercion, through the very mundane social process of meeting people, doing small favors, discovering that the money was extraordinary, and making choices that led him deeper in. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Mermelstein had become the Medellín cartel's chief logistics coordinator for U.S. operations. That title doesn't convey the scale of what he actually did. He designed smuggling systems. He engineered false compartments in furniture, in cars, in airplane cargo holds. He figured out how to move cocaine through U.S. customs without detection. He ran training programs for cartel smugglers, teaching them American customs procedures, teaching them how to behave at border checkpoints, teaching them what aroused suspicion and what didn't. He was, in the language of organized crime, a logistics genius, and the Medellín cartel used his talents to devastating effect. Over the course of his career with the cartel, roughly 1978 to 1985, Max Mermelstein is reputed to have coordinated the smuggling of 56 tons of cocaine into the United States. 56 tons. At the street values of the early 1980s, that represents approximately $125 billion in drugs. One man, 7 years. $125 billion. In 1985, he was arrested while driving near his home in Davie, Florida. The cartel refused to post his $1 million bail, and Max Mermelstein engineer, logistician. The man who literally built the American end of the Medellín cocaine machine made a calculation. The same kind of calculation an engineer makes. The expected value of flipping was higher than the expected value of loyalty to an organization that had just left him to rot. He became a DI informant, and the information he provided was, according to DI officials, the most valuable single source of intelligence in the entire history of Miami drug enforcement. He knew everything: the routes, the methods, the names, the money trails, the organizational structure, the supplier contacts, all of it. His testimony helped convict dozens of cartel operatives and associates. He entered the Federal Witness Protection Program. He wrote a memoir, The Man Who Made It Snow, published in 1990, which remains one of the most detailed first-person accounts of the inner workings of the Medellín cartel. Max Mermelstein died on September 12, 2008, at age 65 of cancer, somewhere in the United States, under a different name, in a location that remains classified as part of his witness protection agreement. He died, as the witness protection program intended, invisible, a ghost, but while he was alive, he gave the world more insight into how the cocaine empire really worked than almost anyone who survived. Let me give you a number: 621. That's how many people were murdered in Miami in 1981. 621 people killed in a single year in a city of roughly 350,000. That translates to a homicide rate of approximately 36 per 100,000 residents. To put that in modern context, New York City's murder rate in 2023 was approximately 58 per 100,000. Chicago, a city that gets relentlessly cited as uniquely violent, was around 24 per 100,000 in its worst recent years. Detroit, perennially one of the most dangerous American cities, hovers around 40 per 100,000 in its worst periods. Miami in 1981 was worse than any of them. It was genuinely, statistically, the murder capital of the United States. Not a nickname, a fact. The progression was stunning in its speed. In 1979, there were 349 murders in Miami. In 1980, 573. In 1981, 621. 3 years, a jump of 78% in murders. In a city that was simultaneously growing, so these aren't just raw numbers increasing with population. The rate was accelerating. The medical examiner's office was overwhelmed in a way that seems almost comically grim in retrospect, except that nothing about it was comic at the time. By the summer of 1981, the county morgue had more bodies than it could store. The refrigeration capacity was exceeded. There were literally not enough drawers. So the Miami-Dade medical examiner leased a refrigerated truck, a Ryder truck, the same kind used to move furniture, parked it outside the morgue, rented it for $800 per month, and used it to store the overflow bodies of homicide victims because the building itself couldn't hold them all. Think about what that means. This is not a war zone. This is not a city under siege by a foreign army. This is a major American metropolitan area in one of the wealthiest nations in human history. And the bodies of murdered people are being stored in a rental truck in a parking lot because there are simply too many of them. The national media descended. In November 1981, Time magazine ran its now famous Paradise Lost cover story, documenting Miami's transformation from sun-drenched retirement haven to, in their words, an ethnically balkanized, crime-infested city teetering on the edge of something catastrophic. The photographs that ran alongside those stories: Miami police at crime scenes, shell casings on suburban streets, bodies in mall parking lots, looked like a city at war, because it was. And the people doing the shooting were not the Mariel arrivals in any simple sense. The Mariel arrivals were foot soldiers. The architects were Colombian. The Cocaine Cowboys, the Colombians who brought the cartel's operational culture to Miami, imported something along with the cocaine that nobody in American law enforcement had ever seen at this scale. They brought the Sicario model. In Colombia, the drug cartels had developed a systematic approach to violence that was functionally a murder-for-hire industry. Professional killers, sicarios, who could be contracted for specific jobs, who operated in teams, who used specific methods, who were efficient, disciplined, and terrifyingly skilled at their work. And those methods, motorcycle assassinations, car bombs, the use of terror as a business tool, arrived in Miami along with the first bricks of Medellín cocaine. The city would never be the same. It's 2:30 in the afternoon, July 11th, 1979, Dadeland Mall, Miami. One of the most ordinary places imaginable, a suburban shopping center in Kendall, South Miami-Dade County. Families are shopping. People are picking up groceries. A couple is looking at furniture. Kids are getting ice cream. This is exactly as mundane and normal as it sounds. Inside the Crown Liquor Store at Dadeland Mall, a man named German Jimenez Paneso is making a purchase. Jimenez Paneso is not a random shopper. He is a significant figure in the Colombian cocaine trafficking network operating in Miami. His bodyguard, Juan Carlos Hernandez, is with him. Two men walk into the liquor store. What happens next takes about 30 seconds. The men open fire with semi-automatic weapons. Dozens of rounds in a confined commercial space. Jimenez Paneso and his bodyguard are killed. Two liquor store employees are wounded. The shooters run out of the store, across the parking lot, and jump into a white van waiting for them. The van pulls away. It is gone before police arrive. When police catch up with the van, abandoned in the far end of the parking lot, they discover what one officer described as a war wagon. Inside, multiple firearms, bulletproof vests, extra ammunition. This was not a hasty hit. This was a planned, military-style execution in a suburban shopping mall. A Miami police officer at the scene, looking at the shell casings scattered across the asphalt, at the bullet holes in cars, at the witnesses in shock, coined a phrase. He called the shooters, and by extension, the whole culture of Colombian drug violence that this represented, Cocaine Cowboys. The name stuck. It would define an era. The van was not labeled anything suspicious. It was a phony delivery vehicle marked Happy Time Complete Party Supply. The irony of the name Happy Time on a vehicle used to carry out a broad daylight murder in a mall parking lot is almost too on the nose for fiction. The orders for the hit are believed by investigators, including former Miami homicide detective Nelson Andrew, who worked the Cocaine Cowboys cases, to have come from Griselda Blanco, a Colombian woman who had come to Miami in the early 1970s, was arguably the most ruthless operator in the entire cocaine war. She was known as La Madrina, the godmother, or more chillingly, the Black Widow. She is suspected of ordering dozens of murders, possibly up to 200 by some law enforcement estimates, during her career. She was never convicted in connection with the Dadeland shooting. She did eventually do significant prison time in the United States on drug charges before being deported back to Colombia, where she was shot to death by a motorcycle-riding assassin in September 2012. The poetry of that ending is not lost on anyone. What made Dadeland different from all the cocaine-related murders that came before it was its setting. Before July 11th, 1979, the cocaine war's violence was happening in back alleys, in private residences, in warehouses, in places that ordinary Miami residents could tell themselves were far away from their lives. The violence was real, but it was possible to pretend it was contained. Dadeland Mall was not a back alley. It was where you went on a Thursday afternoon with your kids to buy shoes and get a Whopper. It was the most normal, familiar, mundane American setting imaginable. And two men with automatic weapons had just executed people in it. Former Detective Andrew put it plainly in a 2019 interview. What was learned from the Dadeland shooting is that it's real. These guys will go out there, and if they want to hit someone, it doesn't matter where it happens, who else is around, or the time of day. They're gonna get their target. After Dadeland, nobody in Miami could pretend anymore. The cocaine war was not contained. It was everywhere, and it was about to get much worse. The Dadeland massacre was shocking for its boldness. But the true horror of the Miami cocaine wars wasn't the public executions. It was what happened in private. Let's talk about the chainsaw murders, because this is where Scarface connects directly to documented reality. And Oliver Stone was not subtle about where he got the idea. Between 1979 and 1982, Miami homicide detectives encountered multiple cases in which victims had been killed using a chainsaw. Not stabbed with a screwdriver that happened to be large. Not killed in an industrial accident. Tortured and murdered with a chainsaw. Deliberately, as a method of execution. The Colombian cartel operators brought this method from South America, where it had been used and continues to be used as a tool of terror against rivals and informants. The logic is chilling in its practicality. A chainsaw death sends a message. It says we are not afraid of anything. It says we operate without any limit. It says if you cross us, this is what happens to you. And critically, the method of death, when discovered by others in the organization, creates exactly the kind of fear that keeps people loyal. Oliver Stone has stated explicitly in multiple interviews, including a detailed conversation with GQ, that the chainsaw scene in Scarface came directly from his research. He spoke to DA Gents. He read Miami Herald archives. He talked to defense lawyers who had represented cartel-connected clients, and he was told about these murders. He described them in those interviews as gruesome, and said that cartel operatives would sometimes write in blood on the walls of victims, marking them as informants or traitors. The bathroom scene in Scarface. Tony Montana tied to the shower rod. The chainsaw. The blood is not Oliver Stone's imagination. It is Oliver Stone's journalism. The connection to Mario Tabraue is particularly direct. In testimony presented at Tabraue's trial, prosecutors described the 1980 murder of Larry Nash, the ATF informant who had been working inside Tabraue's operation. Nash was killed, and a chainsaw was allegedly used in the disposal of the body. The Miami New Times reported these details. Those reports were in the public record, and Oliver Stone was reading the public record. Now, chainsaws were not the only method, not even close. Car bombs were another import from Colombia, where the Medellín cartel had used them extensively against judges, politicians, and rival traffickers. In Colombia, a car bomb was a political weapon as much as a criminal one. Pablo Escobar would later use car bombs against the Colombian government in campaigns of terror during the late 1980s and early 1990s. In Miami, car bombs arrived in the early 1980s. Miami Herald archives document multiple car bombings during this period. The psychological impact on ordinary Miami residents was documented and significant. In 1981 and 1982, Miami Herald reporters interviewed residents who said they had begun habitually checking under their cars before getting in each morning. Not just drug dealers, regular suburban residents. Accountants, teachers, people who had nothing to do with drugs and knew it, but who lived in a city where a car bomb in a parking lot was a real possibility. Think about that behavioral change for a second. You're a high school teacher in Coconut Grove in 1982. You wake up, you have your coffee, you go out to your car, and you crouch down and check underneath it before you get in. Because there was a car bombing on the news last week, and the week before, and the week before that. That's not a movie. It was someone's actual Tuesday morning. Motorcycle assassinations were the third primary method, and the one most directly imported from the Colombian Sicario model. Two-man teams, a driver and a shooter. They would identify a target's vehicle in traffic or at a known location. The driver would pull up alongside or behind. The shooter would fire through the car window. The motorcycle would speed away before witnesses could react. This method was devastatingly effective. It was fast, it was mobile, it was very difficult to stop, and it was visible, which was sometimes the point. Killing someone in traffic, in front of other drivers, sent a message to the entire network that nobody was safe anywhere. Miami police identified specific motorcycle assassination teams operating in the city on what amounted to a contract basis during the early 1980s. These teams were identified in D and NDPD records as sicarios operating in the style of their Colombian counterparts. The two-man motorcycle team became a signature of the cocaine war, specific enough to be identifiable, efficient enough to be preferred. Former homicide detective Nelson Andrew, who worked these cases for years, described the period in stark terms. Police at the time were still equipped with 6-shot revolvers. The criminals were carrying MAC-10 machine pistols capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, Uzi submachine guns, AR-15 semi-automatic rifles. There was an equipment gap between law enforcement and organized crime that was genuinely dangerous. It was complete chaos in those days, Andrew said. We didn't have advances in technology. Surveillance cameras were very limited. No DNA, nothing like that. Basically fingerprints and witness testimony. And witnesses were terrified to testify. The DEA's official history of the period documents that in 1979 alone, there were 349 murders in Miami, with the vast majority connected to the drug trade. By the early 1980s, D agents assigned in Miami were processing more violent crime cases per week than agents in any other city in the country. It was a war, not a metaphor, a war, and civilians were caught in the middle of it. The violence is one side of the story. The other side, the one that Oliver Stone captured and that audiences around the world have been fascinated by for 40 years, is the extraordinary opulence. Because whatever else the Cocaine Cowboys were, they were not subtle, Star Island. If you've ever been to Miami, you've probably driven over the MacArthur Causeway and caught a glimpse of it, a private island off the coast of Miami Beach, accessible only by a single guarded bridge, ringed by the kind of mansions that make the word mansion feel inadequate. Today it's home to celebrities, tech billionaires, retired athletes. In the early 1980s, it was home to cocaine traffickers. Jon Roberts' Star Island property was purchased in cash. At the time, the early 1980s, properties on Star Island were selling for $2 million to $3 million. In today's money, that's $6 million to $9 million. Cash in a duffel bag to a real estate agent who filed the required currency transaction report and watched the sale go through anyway. The security at these properties was serious and visible. Perimeter walls, electronic gates, security cameras at multiple points, armed guards, not the rent-a-cop variety, but serious men with military and law enforcement backgrounds who understood that the people they were guarding had made enemies who were genuinely capable of sophisticated violence inside. The interior design of a Cocaine Cowboy mansion was a very specific aesthetic. Marble from Italy, not domestic marble, Italian marble. Because the distinction mattered, and the price difference was irrelevant. Gold accents on fixtures, railings, and furniture. Custom furniture, oversized, because normal-sized furniture looked wrong in rooms with 18-foot ceilings. Art that was purchased not for taste, but for price. The bigger the number on the invoice, the more it communicated. Weapons were integrated throughout the house as a matter of security doctrine. Firearms in closets, under beds, in false walls. Accessible from multiple rooms. The logic was straightforward. If someone came for you, they were coming with a team, and you needed to be able to arm yourself from wherever you happened to be when it started. Mario Tabraue's property in Coconut Grove was the most extraordinary in its specific detail. The mansion itself was significant, but the property surrounding it was, in the truest sense of the word, a zoo, lions, tigers, cheetahs, monkeys, cobras, rattlesnakes, exotic birds of species that were not legal to own without specific federal permits. And in some cases, not legal to own at all. Federal agents who eventually raided the property described it as something between a luxury residence and a wildlife preserve. Animals in purpose-built enclosures, but also animals in the house itself, and animals roaming areas of the grounds. A private zoo that was also somehow a drug trafficking headquarters. Tony Montana's fish tank and pet tiger, referenced in Scarface, were not purely symbolic. They were based on reporting about what real cocaine cowboys actually kept in their real homes. The contrast between the violence of the profession and the luxury of the lifestyle was stark and intentional. These were men who had come from nothing, poverty, prison, the bottom of the social order, and were now living in homes that would have been impossible even for wealthy Americans to replicate. The mansion was the trophy. It was the proof. It was the physical, visible, undeniable evidence that they had made it, and they kept it. Right up until the morning the federal agents knocked on the door. Here's a problem that almost no human being has ever had, that almost no human brain is equipped to process. You have too much money, not theoretically too much, literally, physically, too much money. Jon Roberts described this in American Desperado in detail that is almost comedic if you're not the one living it. Industrial currency counting machines, the kind that major banks use, running in his home 24 hours a day. Still not fast enough. Cash arrived in duffel bags, in suitcases, in boxes that said things like machine parts or clothing on the outside. Each shipment represented another delivery, another successful transit, another few hundred kilograms of cocaine successfully distributed and sold. The cash was the receipt, and it was overwhelming. Roberts described having closets, actual closets in his Star Island mansion, stacked floor to ceiling with bricks of $100 bills, bricks of cash, rubber banded and stacked like they were bricks of wood in a fireplace. Hundreds of thousands of dollars per closet, multiple closets, and when the closets were full, he started opening walls, literally, opening the drywall of his house, stacking cash inside the wall cavity, sealing it back up, and painting over it. The same method of concealment that people used to hide things they never want found. Except the thing he was hiding was money, millions of dollars. In the walls of his house, some of that money, Roberts acknowledged in his memoir and in interviews, was hidden so thoroughly, in locations he lost track of, in walls of properties that changed hands, in buried containers in yards of houses that were later sold and demolished, that it was never recovered. It is presumably still somewhere in South Florida, in the walls of someone's house, under someone's backyard, in a waterproof container in the bottom of a retention pond. The D and federal prosecutors seized more than $1 billion in assets from Miami cocaine traffickers during the enforcement crackdown of the late 1980s. $1 billion in 1980s money. That's the stuff they found. Experts believe that billions more were never recovered and remained hidden. The money laundering operations were creative and almost industrial in scale. Cash businesses were the first and most obvious avenue. Restaurants, car washes, nightclubs, strip clubs, businesses with legitimate revenue that could be inflated with drug cash and then reported as taxable income. The Mutiny Hotel, which we'll get to shortly, was one of the best examples of this. A legitimate business that also served as the social hub of the cocaine world. Real estate was the second major avenue, buying properties in cash, sometimes through shell companies, sometimes directly, and then selling them at slightly marked up prices to create a paper trail of legitimate real estate transactions. Miami real estate in the early 1980s was experiencing its own boom in part because tens of millions of dollars of cocaine money was flowing into property purchases. Colombian smuggling operations also used the Black Peso exchange, a sophisticated currency exchange scheme in which Colombian pesos were traded for US dollars through a network of exchange houses, effectively laundering drug money into legitimate appearing currency transactions. None of it was ultimately sufficient. You can be creative, you can be sophisticated, but when you're generating tens of millions of dollars per month in cash, the sheer volume becomes impossible to completely disguise. The money, eventually, is what gave the investigators their best evidence. Spending patterns, assets, properties, car purchases. Financial forensics that asked a simple question: where did this money come from? For Mario Tabraue, Jon Roberts, and eventually dozens of other Miami cocaine traffickers, the answer to that question led directly to a federal indictment. Let's talk about the cars, because the cars are not a footnote. The cars were a message. Jon Roberts, at his peak, owned 7 Ferraris simultaneously, not over his lifetime. At the same time, a Testarossa, the iconic wedge-shaped supercar that became the symbol of 1980s excess, with the wide rear haunches and side strakes that every 10-year-old in 1985 had a poster of. Multiple 308s, the Ferrari that Magnum P.I. drove in the TV show, which was filming in Miami at exactly the same time. A 328, a Boxer, at $1,982 1984 prices. A new Ferrari cost between $60,000 and $150,000, depending on the model. Adjusted for inflation, that's $180,000 to $450,000 in today's money. 7 of them, simultaneously. He bought them at dealerships, not through brokers, not through private sales. He walked into Ferrari and Lamborghini dealerships in Miami and Broward County with duffel bags of cash. There was no negotiation. The interaction was simple. I'll take that one. Cash on the table. The dealers were legally required to file currency transaction reports for cash purchases over $10,000 with the IRS. They did. Nobody followed up. Not for years. Roberts also had a Lamborghini Countach, the car with the scissor doors that went straight up, the car that existed at the intersection of engineering and insanity, the car that made every traffic light it sat at feel like a runway. These cars were not just transportation, they were advertising. Driving a Testarossa down Biscayne Boulevard at 11 p.m. on a Saturday was a communication to everyone who mattered in Miami's cocaine world. You didn't need to say anything. The car said it for you. The parking lot of the Mutiny Hotel on any Friday night in 1983 looked like a Ferrari. Dealership had moved its entire inventory to Coconut Grove and arranged it under the palm trees. Rows of red and yellow and silver supercars, side by side, owned by men who had arrived in Miami a few years ago with nothing and were now living a lifestyle that had no American precedent. The cars were also eventually seized. When the federal asset forfeitures started in the late 1980s, U.S. Marshals auctioned Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and Porsches by the lot. Some went to de-agents. Some went to civilians who bought them at government auction for significantly less than market value and got the bargain of their lifetimes. If you want to understand the social world of the Cocaine Cowboys, how they relaxed, how they spent money, how they interacted with each other and with the legitimate world around them, you need to understand the Mutiny Hotel, located at 2951 South Bayshore Drive in Coconut Grove. The Mutiny Hotel was, between approximately 1979 and 1985, the single most extraordinary establishment in Miami, maybe the most extraordinary establishment in the United States. It was, on paper, a luxury boutique hotel with a members-only nightclub on the ground floor. It had 130 rooms, a prestigious address in one of Miami's most beautiful neighborhoods, waterfront access, and a nightclub that was, by the standards of its time, genuinely world-class. Good sound system, good lighting, beautiful staff, great food and drinks. In practice, it was the headquarters of the Cocaine Cowboy world. The parking lot on a weekend night was wall-to-wall supercars. Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Porsches, Mercedes. The clients inside included Colombian traffickers, Mariel-era Cuban dealers, American operators like Jon Roberts, celebrity entertainers who wanted to be in the most exciting room in Miami, politicians, lawyers, real estate developers, and, according to author Robin Farzad, who wrote Hotel Scarface, CIA operatives who were monitoring the cocaine trade and occasionally interacting with it in ways that the official record does not fully capture. Cocaine was not hidden at the Mutiny. It was served at tables alongside the drinks and the food, not literally on the menu, but with about as much discretion as ordering a cocktail. You sat down, you were a member. You were known, cocaine appeared on the table. This is documented in federal court records, in FBI surveillance reports, in the memories of dozens of people who were there. Waiters at the Mutiny made $1,000 to $5,000 per night in tips on a single shift because the people tipping them were men who physically could not spend their money as fast as they made it and had stopped caring about the amounts involved. The FBI had surveillance cameras in a vehicle parked outside, photographing license plates of cars entering and exiting the parking lot, building organizational charts, documenting who met whom. This is documented in FBI files. While the Cocaine Cowboys were partying inside, federal agents were outside in a van with camera equipment, recording their every arrival and departure. And the Cocaine Cowboys either didn't know or didn't care. Oliver Stone was brought to the Mutiny during his research trip to Miami. He sat in that room, he absorbed the atmosphere, and he created the Babylon Club, Tony Montana's home base in the film. The place where he holds court at the best table with the best view, and everyone in the room knows exactly who he is. The Mutiny Hotel is the Babylon Club, not inspired by it, not based on it, not a loose adaptation. It is the Babylon Club. Same city, same era, same function, same people, same energy. The Mutiny today is a residential condominium complex. The nightclub is gone. The parking lot of Ferraris is a memory. But if you go to 2951 South Bayshore Drive and look at the building, you're looking at the place where the real version of Scarface was written. January 20th, 1981. Ronald Reagan takes the oath of office. Reagan's political agenda was focused primarily on the Soviet Union, economic deregulation, and tax cuts. Drug enforcement was not his initial passion. His administration came into office talking about reducing the size of government, not expanding federal law enforcement, but Miami had become a national embarrassment. The Time magazine cover, the nightly network news segments, footage of a city where people were checking under their cars before starting them in the morning, where the medical examiner rented a refrigerator truck for overflow bodies, where a shooting at a suburban shopping mall had introduced the term Cocaine Cowboys to the American vocabulary. This was not acceptable, not politically, not publicly, not for a president whose entire brand was projecting strength and restoring American greatness. In February 1982, Reagan publicly characterized the cocaine situation in South Florida as epidemic drug smuggling. That had created a serious problem. He directed Vice President George H.U. Bush, who had previously been CIA director and was considered to have significant intelligence and law enforcement experience, to chair a new South Florida task force specifically targeting the cocaine trade. The resources that followed were significant. The DEA's budget was substantially increased. The FBI, which had previously focused primarily on organized crime and national security and left drug enforcement largely to the DEA, was redirected to treat major drug cases as a priority. The U.S. Customs Service received new assets, new personnel, new authority, most importantly for the operational picture. The U.S. Coast Guard received a major upgrade. New, faster patrol boats that could actually keep pace with the cigarette boats used by cocaine smugglers. New helicopters, expanded radar coverage over the Florida Straits. The gap between law enforcement capabilities and smuggler capabilities, which had been yawning, began to close. The South Florida Task Force was unusual for the era in that it was genuinely interagency. FBI, Customs, Coast Guard, and local Miami-Dade law enforcement working together with shared intelligence. In theory, in practice, the interagency coordination was often messy, with turf battles and information-sharing failures, but the overall effect was a dramatic increase in law enforcement pressure on the cocaine network. Drug seizures in South Florida increased by approximately 50% in the first year of the task force's operation. According to Reagan's own remarks to the task force in November 1982, marijuana seizures went up 35%. Cocaine seizures went up significantly. These numbers need to be understood carefully. They represent both more seizures and more total drug flow. The market was so large that seizing substantially more product didn't dramatically reduce supply, but it drove up the risk premium for smugglers, which drove up prices, which changed the economics of the business, which eventually made some operations unprofitable or too dangerous. The long-term significance of the task force model was institutional. It established the framework for interagency drug enforcement that would define U.S. narcotics policy for decades, the collaborative structure, the shared intelligence databases, the combined operational command. All of it was built in South Florida in 1982, using Miami as the laboratory, and it worked, not immediately, not dramatically in the short term, but inexorably over years. The intelligence picture got clearer, the organizational charts got more complete, the financial forensics got more sophisticated, and the cocaine cowboys began to fall. The DEA's official history of the 1980 to 1985 period lays out the investigative methods in considerable detail. And what's striking reading those accounts is how systematic and methodical the process was. Not dramatic, not cinematic, patient, thorough, expensive in time and resources. Let's walk through the four main methods that brought down Miami's cocaine empire. Wiretaps. Court-ordered telephone surveillance was the foundation of most major prosecutions. Getting a wiretap order required demonstrating probable cause to a federal judge, showing that specific criminal activity was being conducted through specific phone lines. The evidentiary bar was significant, which meant that investigators had to build cases by other means first, developing enough evidence to justify the wiretap, and then use the wiretap to develop more evidence, layer upon layer. The Cocaine Cowboys were not naive about phone surveillance. By the early 1980s, sophisticated traffickers used multiple phones, rotating numbers, prepaid lines, payphones, and spoke in coded language. Merchandise and product for cocaine. Fish or other innocuous terms for kilo quantities. Number codes for prices and delivery schedules. But coded language only works if the code is consistent and the people using it are disciplined. In a large organization with dozens of participants of varying sophistication and varying discipline, code breaks down. People slip into plain language when they're tired, when they're high, when they're arguing. Investigators with 24/7 listening operations, with Spanish translation specialists working in shifts around the clock, caught those slips. Physical surveillance, following targets, photographing meetings, building organizational charts documenting who met whom, when and where. This was unglamorous, labor-intensive work. Agents sitting in unmarked cars in Miami heat for hours, photographing a license plate, following a car to a meeting location, photographing who went in and came out. The FBI's surveillance of the Mutiny Hotel parking lot, which we've already discussed, produced years of photographic documentation of who was meeting whom in Miami's cocaine world, building a picture of the network from the outside, one license plate and one facial photograph at a time. The organizational charts that emerged from this work were extraordinary documents. Boxes and lines and arrows connecting names. Who reported to whom? Who supplied whom? Who was connected to what Colombian source? Maps of a criminal enterprise built entirely from publicly observable behavior over months and years of surveillance. Financial forensics. This was, ultimately, the most devastating weapon. The Cocaine Cowboys were making money at a scale it was impossible to hide completely. Cash purchases of real estate, cars, boats, jewelry, all created paper trails. Federal law required reporting of cash transactions over $10,000. And while that reporting was often ignored in practice during the early years, the reports existed, the filings accumulated, the financial picture took shape. Investigators began with a simple question. What is this person's legitimate income? Tax returns, employment records, business filings. Then they looked at spending patterns, real estate purchases, car registrations, boat registrations, bank accounts, credit card transactions. When those two pictures were set side by side, legitimate income versus documented assets and spending, the gap was often catastrophic. A man who filed tax returns showing $80,000 in annual income, who owned a $3 million Star Island mansion, 7 Ferraris, and a yacht had a significant explanatory problem. This unexplained wealth model was the backbone of the racketeering prosecutions that brought down the Cocaine Cowboys. You didn't have to catch someone in the act of selling drugs. If you could prove they were living on money that had no legitimate source, undercover operations, and the informant cascade. Here's the most human element of the investigative story, and the most morally complex. The agents went undercover as buyers, making small recorded purchases, building recorded evidence of the network from the inside, small transactions, then slightly larger ones, building relationships and trust while recording everything. But the really critical element was informants. Low-level dealers, when arrested, were offered a choice: cooperation or prosecution to the full extent. The math was usually straightforward. Cooperation meant a reduced sentence. Prosecution meant federal mandatory minimums that could be devastating. When a low-level dealer flipped, he could give up a mid-level distributor. That mid-level distributor, when flipped, could give up a senior operator. Each level of cooperation opened the next level. It was a cascade, each flip enabling the next one, each cooperation creating new leverage. Max Mermelstein was the apex of this cascade. When he flipped in 1985, he wasn't a street dealer or a mid-level distributor. He was the logistics architect of the entire American end of the Medellín supply chain. His cooperation gave investigators a view into the cartel's operations that they had never had before, from the inside. At the highest level, D officials described Mermelstein's cooperation as transformative. It didn't just help convict a few people. It remapped the DEA's understanding of how the Medellín cartel actually functioned. It gave investigators the names, the routes, the methods, the organizational structure. It accelerated dozens of investigations simultaneously. The Cocaine Cowboys had been operating on the assumption that their compartmentalization was sufficient protection, that if any one person was arrested and flipped, they could only reveal their immediate circle. Mermelstein proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. Someone at his level knew enough to unravel the whole thing. The cascade had begun, and it was about to reach Mario Tabraue, Jon Roberts, and the entire upper tier of Miami's cocaine network. The arrests didn't come all at once. They came in waves over several years. As the investigations matured and the prosecutorial cases were built to the point where convictions were near certain, the late 1980s were the period of reckoning. Mario Tabraue, arrested, late 1987. Operation Cobra, the DEA's code name, chosen for the exotic animals at the center of Tabraue's cover business, culminated in December 1987. The federal case against Tabraue was built on a combination of wiretap evidence accumulated over years, financial forensics documenting the gap between his reported income and his demonstrated assets and spending, and cooperating witnesses who had been inside the organization. The charges were sweeping: 61 counts of racketeering, drug trafficking, and conspiracy to murder federal agents. The conspiracy to murder charge related specifically to the death of Larry Nash, the ATF informant, at trial. The evidence was overwhelming. Tabraue was convicted. The sentence: 100 years in federal prison. 100 years in a federal penitentiary, with no possibility of parole under the sentencing structure of the late 1980s. That was a life sentence with mathematical certainty. Mario Tabraue, at age 26, was going to die in federal prison. Except he didn't. After his conviction, Tabraue did what almost every major figure in organized crime eventually does when facing an impossible sentence with no other options. He cooperated. He provided testimony against other members of Miami's criminal network. He gave investigators information about operations, individuals, and activities that he had direct knowledge of. In exchange, his sentence was reduced. He served 12 years. He was released in late 1999. He was 38 years old on the day he walked out of federal prison. Jon Roberts arrested. Late 1980s. Roberts was swept up in the broader D crackdown as the informant cascade worked its way up through the Miami network. The evidence against him was comprehensive financial forensics, wiretap evidence, and testimony from cooperating witnesses who knew the details of his operations. Like Tabraue, Roberts ultimately cooperated with federal authorities, providing testimony and intelligence that helped prosecutors build cases against other traffickers. His cooperation resulted in a significantly reduced sentence. He was released in the early 2000s. What did he do? He went to Hollywood, Florida, not far from where his cocaine empire had been headquartered, and he wrote a book, American Desperado, co-written with journalist Evan Wright. Published in 2011, it was exhaustively detailed, including descriptions of events and individuals that had not previously appeared in any public record. It was reviewed as one of the most significant criminal memoirs of its era. Jon Roberts died in 2011. The same year the book was published, of natural causes, in a bed, not in a fountain riddled with bullets, Max Mermelstein, arrested and flipped. 1985. Mermelstein's story is the most unusual because his cooperation came before the major prosecutions that it enabled. He didn't cooperate after being convicted. He cooperated almost immediately after being arrested, becoming an active D asset while the major investigations were still in their formative stages. His contributions were, by D accounts, extraordinary. He knew the entire American end of the Medellín supply chain from the inside. He could identify people, routes, methods, and financial structures that investigators would have taken years to discover through conventional means. If they ever discovered them at all, he entered witness protection. He wrote his memoir, The Man Who Made It Snow, published in 1990, one of the earliest comprehensive accounts of the Medellín cartel's American operations. Written from inside, he moved under an assumed name to an undisclosed location. Max Mermelstein died on September 12, 2008, at age 65, cancer, in Lexington, Kentucky, under a name that is not recorded in any public document associated with Max Mermelstein. He died invisible, which was exactly the point. The asset seizures, when the arrests came, the seizures followed. Federal marshals executed warrants on properties. Vehicles, bank accounts, businesses, boats, jewelry, art. Everything that could be documented as the proceeds of drug trafficking was seized, cataloged, and auctioned. The mansions on Star Island went to federal auction. Properties in Coconut Grove, the Ferraris and Lamborghinis, lined up in D lots, auctioned off in lots to the highest bidders. Some buyers got extraordinary deals. A nearly new Ferrari Testarossa at a government auction price of $35,000. Cash found in safes, in walls, in buried containers in yards. Counted, logged, deposited into federal accounts. The total value of assets seized from Miami cocaine traffickers during the enforcement crackdown of the late 1980s exceeded $1 billion in 1980s dollars. $1 billion. And that's what they found. The money in the walls of demolished houses, the cash in buried waterproof containers in backyards that became subdivisions, the bricks of hundreds in wall cavities that are now condominiums in Brickell or Coral Gables. That money is almost certainly still there. Billions of dollars, somewhere in South Florida, hidden so well that even its owners forgot where they put it. Oliver Stone wrote the screenplay for Scarface in 1982 under extraordinary personal circumstances. He was researching and writing simultaneously, going to Miami, meeting with D agents, talking to police departments, interviewing defense lawyers who represented cartel-connected clients, visiting Bimini to observe the cigarette boat smuggling routes firsthand. He was also by his own admission in a detailed 2020 GQ interview. Using cocaine throughout the research phase, he described himself as an addict during that period. He eventually went to Paris to get clean before finishing the script, believing with some confidence that cocaine would be harder to obtain there than in the Miami environment he'd been living in. The research paid off, because here's the thing that gets lost in 40 years of Scarface being a cultural touchstone. The movie is much more accurate than it looks. Let's go through the major elements. The Mariel Boatlift opening. Scarface opens with actual documentary-style footage and narration about the 1980 Mariel Boatlift. It explicitly establishes that Tony Montana is a Mariel refugee, one of the Cubans Castro mixed into the legitimate refugee flow. A man with a criminal record in Cuba who slipped through the processing system and ended up in Miami. This is not dramatic license. This is an accurate representation of what happened. Thousands of criminals came through the Mariel process. Many of them, like Tony Montana in the film, provided false information about their Cuban criminal histories. The processing chaos at the Orange Bowl, referenced in the film's opening, was real. Stone got this exactly right. The Mariel Boatlift is not a backdrop in Scarface. It is the causal mechanism. Tony Montana exists because Castro opened the port of Mariel. The film understands this, starting from nothing. Tony works his way up from the very bottom. Dishwasher at a restaurant, small jobs for small money, building a reputation for reliability and willingness to take risks, moving up gradually through the organizational structure, eventually being given bigger responsibilities because of demonstrated performance. Mario Tabraue's trajectory matches this almost exactly. Jon Roberts started in Miami without the cocaine infrastructure fully built. The Cocaine Cowboys didn't arrive fully formed. They accumulated power gradually, demonstrating their utility at each level until they had enough leverage to operate independently. The rags to riches through crime arc is not Hollywood mythology in this case. It is the documented trajectory of the real men. The chainsaw scene, we've established this one clearly. Stone confirmed in multiple interviews that the chainsaw scene came directly from his research. The D agents he spoke to described real chainsaw murders in Miami. Those cases were in federal records. Mario Tabraue's operation had a documented connection to a chainsaw murder. The scene is journalism in screenplay form. The specific detail of the cheap motel bathroom setting is also accurate to documented cases. These murders did not happen in mansions. They happened in rented rooms where the bodies could be disposed of without connecting the killing to the perpetrator's home addresses. Stone knew this. He put it in the movie, exactly as it had actually happened, the money piling up in Scarface. Tony's accountant is nearly overwhelmed trying to process the cash coming in. There's a famous line in the film about the money arriving faster than it can be laundered. The problem of excess cash, too much too fast, nowhere adequate to put it, is a running theme through Tony's rise. Jon Roberts described this exact situation in American Desperado in precise detail. Industrial currency counters running 24 hours a day. Closets stacked floor to ceiling with bricks of $100 bills. Opening walls to hide cash. Some money hidden so thoroughly it was never recovered. Tony Montana's money problem is Jon Roberts' money problem. The film got this right. The mansion lifestyle. The pool with the fountain. The marble. The gold accents. The oversized custom furniture. The security gates and armed guards. The weapons hidden throughout the house. The private zoo element. The tiger in the mansion scenes was directly inspired by reporting about real cocaine cowboys who kept exotic animals on their properties. Mario Tabraue had lions, tigers, cheetahs, cobras, monkeys. Jon Roberts' Star Island property matched the Scarface aesthetic in detail. The film's production designer did not invent this aesthetic. They documented it, the paranoia. By the end of the film, Tony trusts almost no one. He is isolated, cocaine-fueled, certain that everyone around him is plotting against him. The paranoia is presented as a function of both his cocaine addiction and the genuine reality of his situation. He has made enough enemies that the paranoia is, in fact, rational. Former cocaine traffickers who cooperated with prosecutors and spoke to journalists after their convictions described this exact psychological progression. Cocaine paranoia is clinically real. Chronic cocaine use produces paranoid ideation, hypervigilance, distorted risk assessment. When you combine that with the genuinely dangerous reality of operating at the top of a violent criminal organization where betrayal is common and assassination is a professional tool, you get exactly the state Tony Montana is in during the final act. Stone got this right. The paranoia is not dramatic exaggeration. It is clinical and situational reality, the American-Colombian relationship. Tony's relationship with Alejandro Sosa, the Bolivian supplier in the film, is a careful, professional relationship built on mutual utility and characterized by a fundamental power imbalance. Tony needs Sosa more than Sosa needs Tony. Sosa ultimately holds all the cards. Jon Roberts' relationship with Pablo Escobar, as described in American Desperado, had exactly this structure. Roberts was essential to Escobar's American distribution network, and Escobar treated him with genuine professional respect. But the underlying dynamic was clear. The Colombian supplier was the power in the relationship. The American distributor, however wealthy, was ultimately a service provider. The day Roberts stopped being useful or became a liability, the relationship would end. And probably badly, Stone got this right. The film understands the structural power dynamics of the cartel supply chain, the Babylon Club, the Mutiny Hotel. Already established, Stone went to the mutiny. He absorbed the atmosphere. The Babylon Club in Scarface reproduces it. The cocaine at the tables, the best seats for the most dangerous men, the sense of operating outside normal rules in a space that the street world could see but not fully understand. The Mutiny Hotel is the Babylon Club. Full stop, but Scarface is not a documentary. And the places where Stone departed from reality are as interesting as the places where he got it exactly right. Because each departure was a creative choice with a specific traumatic purpose, and in some cases, reality is stranger and more disturbing than anything the film chose to show. Tony Montana as one person versus reality as dozens. This is the most fundamental difference between the film and reality. Tony Montana is presented as a single individual who builds a single cocaine empire from scratch. His trajectory, from Mariel refugee to cocaine king to tragic fall, is a single man's story with a beginning, middle, and end. The reality was dozens of men. Overlapping stories, competing operations, simultaneous careers that ran in parallel, intersected sometimes violently, and ended at different times in different ways. Mario Tabraue, Jon Roberts' Ferraris, Max Mermelstein's logistics genius. These weren't one man's attributes. They were three different men's defining characteristics, happening in the same city at the same time. Oliver Stone took the greatest hits of Miami's cocaine era and compressed them into a single composite character. This is standard cinematic practice. It creates narrative focus, emotional investment, and a coherent arc. A film about dozens of men with overlapping stories is a miniseries, not a movie. But the result is that audiences walk away thinking the cocaine era was about one man. In reality, It was about a whole generation, a specific cohort of men, shaped by specific historical forces, who made specific choices, and whose collective story is far more complex and far more interesting than any single narrative can capture. The family subplot, Tony's relationship with his sister Gina, his mother and Manny, the incest undertones, the family as both motivation and tragedy, is the emotional core of the film's final act. Without Gina, Tony's final actions make no sense. Without the family dynamic, the movie is a rise and fall story without emotional stakes. In reality, many of the Mariel-era traffickers arrived in Miami alone. They didn't have family in the city. The Mariel Boatlift separated families as often as it reunited them. The Cuban criminals Castro included in the Boatlift weren't necessarily people with loving mothers and devoted sisters waiting in Miami. Jon Roberts had family connections, mob connections in New York, but his Miami life was not built around family. Mario Tabraue had his father as a business partner, but the emotionally complicated sibling dynamic of Scarface doesn't map neatly onto his biography. The family subplot is Oliver Stone's edition. Built entirely for emotional resonance, it works brilliantly as cinema. It is, as biography, almost entirely fictional. The won't kill children moral line. This is the most philosophically significant departure between the film and reality. In the film's climax, Tony refuses to carry out the Sosa-ordered assassination of a UN diplomat when he discovers that the target's children will also die in the car bomb. He has killed dozens of people without hesitation, but he won't kill children. He pulls the detonator trigger out of the assassin's hand. This is the choice that seals his fate. Sosa's retaliation army arrives at the mansion that night. This moral line, this one rule Tony won't break, is what makes Tony Montana sympathetic enough for audiences to follow through 2.5 hours of escalating violence and depravity. Here is the reality. Real traffickers did kill children. Griselda Blanco, the woman who ordered the Dadeland Mall massacre, is documented to have ordered murders in which children were killed or present. The general violence of the Miami cocaine war did not spare children or civilians in the way the film implies. Stone needed Tony Montana to have one line he wouldn't cross, because without it, the audience has no character to follow. They have only a monster. Dramatically, it's the right choice. The film works because of it, but it is not a reflection of how the real Cocaine Cowboys actually operated. The real war had no such line. A country change. Bolivia versus Colombia. Alejandro Sosa in the film is Bolivian. Pablo Escobar was Colombian. The Medellín cartel was Colombian. South American cocaine trafficking in the 1970s and 1980s involved production in Peru and Bolivia, but the organizational power was in Colombia. In Medellín, why did Stone change Colombia to Bolivia? The most credible explanation is legal risk management. In 1983, Pablo Escobar was alive and extremely powerful. Creating a thinly veiled fictional version of Pablo Escobar, a Bolivian drug lord named Sosa, provided some legal distance from potential defamation claims, or, more practically, from the kind of attention that explicitly naming the Medellín cartel might attract. There may also have been a simpler reason. Stone and producer Martin Bregman may not have wanted Scarface to read as a biography of any specific living person. They wanted the freedom of fiction, even within a framework of documentary reality. Whatever the reason, the country change is one of the film's most significant departures from the actual geography of the cocaine trade. The final shootout. Cinema versus reality. Say hello to my little friend. The M16A1 with the grenade launcher, the army of hitmen storming the mansion. Tony Montana taking bullet after bullet, and still standing, still fighting, still roaring, until he falls forward into the fountain below the world is yours globe sculpture. It is one of the most iconic death scenes in cinema history. It is operatically, ecstatically perfect as a movie ending. It gives Tony Montana a death that matches the scale of his life. And it absolutely did not happen. Mario Tabraue was arrested by D agents with a warrant. There was no final battle. There was no dramatic last stand. Federal agents knocked on the door, metaphorically and literally, and Mario Tabraue was taken into custody, processed, arraigned, and held pending trial. It was bureaucratic and inglorious. Jon Roberts was arrested in a law enforcement operation. No grenade launchers, no fountain. Max Mermelstein was arrested while driving near his house in Davie, Florida. He pulled over. He was handcuffed. He made a phone call to the cartel. The cartel declined to pay his bail. He made a deal. No cocaine cowboys died in the cinematic fashion the film depicts. Some were killed by rivals. There are documented cases of cocaine traffickers assassinated during the violence of the 1980s. But the specific narrative of the powerful drug lord making his final stand against an invading army in his own mansion, that didn't happen to any of the major figures. Stone needed this ending because, and then the D arrested him and he cooperated and served 12 years and now runs a zoo. While genuinely extraordinary, doesn't work as the final act of a feature film. Cinema needs catharsis, needs finality, needs a death that feels proportionate to the life. But here's the thing that Stone couldn't have predicted in 1983. The reality of what happened to these men is, in some ways, more haunting than the cinematic version. Tony Montana dies at the peak of his power, in his mansion, with a grenade launcher. At approximately 40 years old, his death is legendary, mythological. Mario Tabraue is alive at 63. He feeds tigers. He was on Netflix. He lobbies Congress about exotic animal regulations. He is real and present and irreducible. And the complexity of what he is, ex-drug lord, animal conservationist, federal convict, zoo operator, TV personality, is something that no film ending can contain. Jon Roberts wrote a book, He Told the Truth, in print, attributed to his name, about everything he did. Then he died naturally, an old man with a memoir. Max Mermelstein is a ghost somewhere in America, under a name that isn't Max Mermelstein. He lived out his last years invisible. And the story of how the most important logistician the Medellín cartel ever employed came to die of cancer in Lexington, Kentucky, unknown to his neighbors, unremarked by his adopted community. That is a story Oliver Stone never told, because he couldn't have imagined it. Reality is always stranger than the movies. Always the cocaine era ended, not all at once, not on a specific date, but gradually, through the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, as the enforcement pressure accumulated, as the major operators were arrested, as the Medellín cartel itself came under existential pressure from Colombian and American law enforcement. Pablo Escobar was killed by Colombian police on December 2, 1993. Hiding on a rooftop in Medellín, the Medellín cartel did not survive him. Its collapse restructured the global cocaine trade. Power shifted to the Cali cartel, and eventually to the Mexican trafficking organizations that dominate the market today. But the specific Cocaine Cowboys Miami chapter of the story was effectively over by the early 1990s. What did Miami become after? The infrastructure that the cocaine era built, paradoxically, unintentionally, contributed to Miami's transformation into a genuinely extraordinary city. The Latin American community that arrived in the 1980s, including many honest Mariel arrivals who had nothing to do with drugs, brought entrepreneurial energy, business networks, cultural vitality, and demographic dynamism that transformed a retirement city into a genuine international metropolis. The financial infrastructure that was built to launder cocaine money, the banks, the real estate networks, the investment channels, didn't disappear when the cocaine did. It transformed. Miami became a legitimate financial center for Latin American capital, a real estate market of international significance, a hub for international business connections between North America and South America. The Cuban-American community, both the pre to 1980 community that had been building Miami since the early 1960s, and the Mariel generation that arrived in 1980, built something remarkable. Miami today is genuinely bilingual and bicultural in a way that no other major American city has achieved. It is one of the most internationally connected cities in the Western Hemisphere. Its art scene, its restaurant scene, its music scene, its financial industry, all of it has a quality that traces in part to the extraordinary human diversity that the 1980s immigration created. Miami's murder rate in 2023 is approximately 14 per 100,000, still higher than the national average, but compared to 36 per 100,000 in 1981, it is a transformed city. The morgue no longer needs a refrigerated truck in the parking lot. But the legacy is not only positive. The cocaine that flowed through Miami in the 1980s was powder cocaine, an expensive product sold to an affluent market. In the mid to late 1980s, a chemical transformation changed the economics of the drug business in a way that was devastating to American communities at a completely different economic level. Crack cocaine, powder cocaine cooked with baking soda and water to create a smokable crystal, produced a cocaine high at a price point that low-income users could afford. A crack rock cost $5. A hit of powder cocaine cost dramatically more. The crack epidemic of the late 1980s and early 1990s devastated American inner cities, black communities in particular, in ways that the powder cocaine era had not. The violence that accompanied the crack trade was, in many neighborhoods, as severe as the cocaine wars of Miami a decade earlier, except now it was distributed across dozens of American cities simultaneously. The mass incarceration crisis of the young crisis, 1990s, was directly connected to the crack epidemic and the mandatory minimum sentencing laws passed in response to it. Millions of Americans, again, disproportionately black Americans, received sentences that destroyed families and communities for a generation. Tony Montana didn't care about crack. Jon Roberts was a powder cocaine man. The Cocaine Cowboys saw themselves as businessmen serving an affluent market. They were not, in their own minds, selling to people who would be destroyed by the product. The full cost of what they built extends far beyond the Ferraris and the mansions and the Mutiny Hotel. It extends to the crack pipe and the mandatory minimum and the prison cell and the family that fell apart because someone's father got 10 years for crack possession in 1991. That's not in Scarface. It's not cinematic. There's no way to make it glamorous or mythological. But it's the real cost, and it deserves to be acknowledged. Let me tell you what happened to Mario Tabraue after he walked out of federal prison in late 1999. He was 38 years old. He had served 12 years of a 100-year sentence. He had cooperated with the federal government, provided testimony, done his time under the law. He had paid his debt to society and was free. He had no money. The federal asset seizures had taken everything. He had no business. He had a criminal record extensive enough to close most legitimate doors. He was middle-aged, starting over with nothing. In the city where he had once been one of the most feared men alive. What he had was his passion for animals that had never left him, even in prison. He had maintained connections to the wildlife world, keeping up with conservation issues, staying current on exotic animal husbandry. Animals were not a cover story for Mario Tabraue. They were the thing that was real to him when everything else fell apart. In 2000, he and his wife Maria, whom he met and married after his release, founded the Zoological Wildlife Foundation in Miami, a real organization with real animals at a real address. ZWF works with big cats, primates, exotic birds, and other species. They do education programs, conservation work, animal encounters with the public. The animals are housed in purpose-built facilities on a property outside Miami. The man, the myth and legend, reads the introduction on the ZWF website's team page. No false modesty there. In 2020, a Netflix documentary series called Tiger King came out and became one of the most watched programs on the platform during the early COVID-19 lockdowns. Tiger King profiled several exotic animal keepers, primarily the wildly flamboyant Joe Exotic, but it also featured Mario Tabraue, and the segments about him were among the most extraordinary in the series. There he is, on Netflix, 60 years old, in his zoo, speaking openly, calmly, directly about his past. The money coming in suitcases to the bank? "I did that," he said, "not with shame, not with braggadocio, with a matter-of-fact quality that is more chilling than either of those alternatives would have been." The Tiger King appearance prompted a wave of renewed interest in his story. Articles in Men's Health, Mother Jones, Oxygen, Deadline Hollywood, where a limited drama series about his life was announced in 2021. The comparison to Tony Montana, which had circulated in Miami criminal justice circles for decades, went mainstream. He acknowledged the Scarface comparisons directly. He was amused by them, or at least appeared to be. He did not deny the parallels. He knew what his life had been. He wasn't hiding from it. He was just also simultaneously a 60-year-old man feeding tigers in the Florida morning sun. Mario Tabraue is 63 or 64 years old as of 2024. He runs his zoo. He has 560,000 followers on Instagram. He posts photographs of himself with big cats and primates and exotic birds. He appears at his facility. He talks to journalists. He is, by any reasonable measure, a free man living an extraordinary life. Think about these two endings side by side. Really sit with them. Tony Montana. Age approximately 38 to 40. Face down in a fountain. The world is yours. Globe above him. Riddled with bullets. Dead. Mario Tabraue. Age 63. Standing next to a tiger. Feeding it. On Netflix. On Instagram. Alive. Which is the more extraordinary ending? Which story do you want? The cinematic myth of the glorious doomed gangster? Or the genuinely incomprehensible truth of the man who did 12 years for a 100-year sentence and came out the other side? I genuinely don't know the answer to that question, but I know which one is real. And I know which one you can visit in Miami on a Tuesday afternoon. Tony Montana doesn't exist. He never did. He is a composite character, a greatest hits album of the Miami cocaine era, assembled by a screenwriter who was doing cocaine during his research trips to the city he was writing about, and had the extraordinary self-awareness to recognize that the truth was the best material he would ever be given. Oliver Stone took the reality of Miami in 198 or 1983 and did what great storytellers do. He compressed it, focused it, gave it a single face and a single arc. He took Mario's zoo and John's Ferraris and Max's logistics and Griselda's violence and the Mutiny Hotels, cocaine tables and the chainsaw, murders in the motel bathrooms and the Mariel Boatlift and the refrigerator truck outside the morgue. He took all of it and turned it into 2.5 hours of Al Pacino. And it worked. God, did it work. 40 years later, people still quote it. People named their companies after it. Rappers built entire careers on its mythology. It is the most referenced gangster film in American hip-hop history. It is a permanent fixture of global popular culture. But the real story, the actual men, the actual events, the actual scale is more extraordinary than the movie. Because the movie had to fit in a theater, reality didn't. 125,000 people in 6 months. 621 murders in a single year. 56 tons of cocaine. $125 billion in drug money. 7 Ferraris simultaneously. A 100-year sentence served in 12. A zoo in Miami. A Netflix documentary. A man who is alive and feeding tigers right now, today, in 2024, who once ran a $75 million criminal empire and was convicted on 61 federal counts. That's the real Scarface. Not one man, all of them. The world was never theirs. They thought it was. For a few extraordinary, violent, opulent, paranoid years, they believed the billboard on Biscayne Boulevard, "The world is yours." They believed it the way only men who came from nothing and built empires with their hands and their nerve can believe something. Absolutely, completely, without reservation. But it wasn't. It never is. The money went to the federal government. The mansions went to auction. The Ferraris got auctioned off on a government lot in Doral. The cocaine stopped flowing when the smugglers went to prison. And the city that had been turned into the murder capital of America rebuilt itself, slowly, painfully, into something genuinely remarkable. But they made one hell of a movie trying to take it. Before I go, drop a comment. Did you know that Tony Montana was a fictional composite? Does Mario Tabraue running a zoo absolutely break your brain? Have you seen Scarface? Does knowing this story change how you see it? Because it should. If you've ever quoted Scarface, if you've ever said, "Say hello to my little friend," or "Every day above ground is a good day," share this video with them. Let them know where it actually came from. Al Pacino played a legend. The Cocaine Cowboys were real. And some of them are still out there alive, with Instagram accounts and zoo animals and memoirs and Netflix documentaries and, somewhere in the walls of old South Florida houses, money that nobody has found yet.